Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, August 7th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the Pac-12, Oregon State and Washington State up there in the Pacific Northwest, talk about some of the different steps that they're taking to go forward here. It sounds like the Big 12 is a real option for them going forward, and we'll break down all of the different details there. Then we'll get into Week 1. We'll talk about who needs a Week 1 win the most. We could talk about Georgia, Notre Dame, Penn State, so many different teams that definitely need that Week 1 win, but there's one team in particular that I think needs it more than anyone, and I'll get into that in the second segment. Then we'll react to the coaches poll. It came out a couple of days ago, definitely some very interesting things in there, and I want to break down who I think is too high, who I think is too low, and then pretty much everyone else is right where they should be relatively. Then we'll get into who needs to make the most out of fall camp. We've kind of been doing this over the last couple of days. We'll continue on today with 6 more teams for you guys. Then we'll get into conference questions, and we'll go to the Big Ten today. We did the SEC yesterday, so we'll get into the Big Ten today with a ton of different questions going into this 2024 season. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and that's always good for the both of us. So if you'd like to use that, ask any question you'd like. That, again, is GSMCpodcast.net. But let's go ahead and jump into segment 1 here, and let's talk about Oregon State and Washington State. They've kind of been sitting out there in the Pacific Northwest alone for quite some time, really since the Pac-12 season ended. But at the end of the day, it became official on August 1st. So they are officially alone. They are officially out there on their own, and the money starts rolling in from some of the people that left them behind. There are a ton of different questions about what the future is going to look like for the Pac-12 and where they could kind of set up shop for the future. The Mountain West was a real option, but it sounds like they're not too keen on joining with these two entities at this point. It sounds like one conference is, though, and that is the Big 12. I want to talk about them real quick because Washington State and Oregon State really just need a lifeline. There's no two ways about that. Frankly, I think they almost have waited too long at this point, but especially over the next little bit, they're going to have to get something in writing. They're going to have to get into some conference going forward and be at least comfortable, be in a place where you know what your future looks like to 2030, because there's a lot of teams that can't say the same thing. So Washington State and Oregon State are kind of in an interesting spot, and Teresa Gould, the Pac-12 commissioner, is in a really interesting spot because you have a lot of options at your disposal, right? You can jump on a number of different ships, and you can, join a group of 5 conference. You can try to get into the ACC. You can wait for everything to start crumbling and try to get an invite to the Big Ten, possibly. The Big 12 is obviously an option here. So there's a ton of different options at their disposal, but there's a difference between having all the options at your disposal hypothetically and realistically. Hypothetically, they have all of those options in the future. Hypothetically, all of that stuff could fall into place, but a lot of stuff needs to go right for that stuff to fall into place. And I think that's the biggest thing that I've kind of unpacked here is when you look at these two programs, the Big 12 would be a great landing spot. There's no two ways about that. I think they would likely be in the Big 12 if there wasn't such a number of teams that you could choose from the Big 12's perspective a year ago, and they probably just didn't have the money to bring in 6 teams. 4 was probably the right number, but this would be a great place for them to end up. You have some of those Pac-12 teams that you've been playing for a number of years already in that conference. You have, a really not as remotely as aggressive of a travel schedule as some of the other people do, unless you have to go down to UCF, then we have a totally different conversation. And frankly, it sounds like that is part of the group that is not too much in favor of this. It sounds like they took a straw poll at some point throughout the last week, 2 weeks, and 5 teams, West Virginia, Cincinnati, Oklahoma State, Kansas, and UCF, were not in favor of this happening. And I think when you're talking about West Virginia, Cincinnati, and UCF, I think the travel has to play a huge role in that, right? You never want to be the team traveling 3,000 miles, 2,000 miles to go play a football game on a Saturday. So that's obviously going to be a factor in Oklahoma State and Kansas. I'm not exactly sure what's going on there, but overall, there is going to be some pushback on this. But it sounds like more and more that ESPN is in favor of this. And frankly, if that's the case, this thing is over. It's almost definitely going to happen. If ESPN is pushing for the Big 12 to do this, then they're going to do it. I can promise you that, because that's where a lot of the money comes from. So there's no doubt in my mind that if ESPN is really behind this, then it's almost definitely going to happen. Now, there's questions of how much they are really behind it and how much the Big 12 is really into this, because a lot of this stuff is just conjecture. It's a lot of rumors going around, a lot of different things kind of bouncing around, and we really don't know what is real, because we haven't heard anything from Brett Yormark, or we haven't heard anything from Teresa Gould on this matter. So obviously a lot of this stuff happens behind closed doors when we don't know it's happening, but it's still one of those things that we can look at as an option. Nothing is set in stone by any means as of right now. So there are a number of different things out there. There are so many different options out there, whether it's them joining the conference immediately and possibly not taking the media deal for the time being, whether it's, joining as a football program and maybe Oregon State as a baseball program, but not joining as any other part of their athletic department, and then they go out and get UConn and Gonzaga to join the Big 12 as basketball teams. So there's a number of different options on the table for what could happen as the Oregon State and Washington State, as they kind of move into this next chapter of what's going on. But I do think the big thing here is when they join the, let's say, hypothetically, when they join the Big 12, let's just use that as the moniker right now. When they join the Big 12, the money from the Pac-12, the other teams in the Pac-12 stops. So I believe it's somewhere over $200 million that is set to come in throughout the next, number of years from the 10 teams that left them behind. That stops because they are no longer the Pac-12. That is a huge reason why they've been trying to keep the Pac-12 moniker as they've gotten into discussions with the Mountain West, because that's the way they keep the money rolling in. And that is a huge, huge thing for these two programs. So you're in kind of an interesting spot. You ask the question of, do you want stability? Do you want to know where you are, know what conference you're going into, and know that that conference is going to be there in 5 years? Or do you want that big time money coming in every single year, be able to kind of field offers and see what happens? I'm firmly on the side of they need stability right this second. I think Oregon State and Washington State and the Pac-12 in general have waited just a little bit too long. I think they need a place like the Big 12 to set up shop, because at this moment in time, they have only lost the amount of power that they had. It felt like when when all the teams left the Pac-12, it really felt like they were in a position to make a lot of a really bad situation, because they had all this money coming in, because they had so many different things bouncing around, that they had an ability to kind of sit back and let things develop and see if they can find somewhere to end up. Now you're at a position where there's a reality where you don't end up anywhere, especially when the ACC comes around and possibly crumbles in a couple of years here, and the Big 12 has Clemson and Florida State and UNC and a number of other teams to choose from before they would even get to Oregon State and Washington State. Frankly, I think you could get all the way down to Georgia Tech and Pittsburgh before you would really have to have a conversation between, is it better to go get Pittsburgh or is it better to go get Oregon State? Everyone above them is absolutely a better asset than Oregon State or Washington State for the Big 12. Now, one thing I will say is that guy right there, Brett Yormark, is one of the most creative commissioners in current day, because he is someone that is attacking realignment in pretty much every facet you could possibly think of. He is doing it, if they have to add certain sports, they're going to do that. If they have to add, elite, programs overall and elite universities, they're more than welcome to do that. So he's bouncing around a number of ideas. So it's a possibility that Oregon State and Washington State go in as a football program, but not with basketball, baseball, or any of the other sports. There's a reality where they go in as football and baseball, but nothing else. There's a reality where they go all the way in, but don't take a ton of the media deals over the next 5 or 10 years. So there's a number of different things on the table, but I can tell you confidently that if Brett Yormark sees the more money to be made, he's going to take that opportunity, because he's a fantastic businessman, and he's someone that has approached this realignment stuff with a lot of foresight and a lot of aggression. So I don't necessarily think it's going to stop right now. I think when you look at Oregon State and Washington State, they're kind of in a position where you're a little bit back into a corner. You're not necessarily in a spot where you can demand much, or you can really wait too much longer, because we know what's happening over in the ACC. We know that there's a reality where in the next couple of years, that is no longer a big-time conference, and that's something that not only the ACC has to worry about, but Washington State and Oregon State have to worry about. We just talked about, at least 2/3 of that conference are more valuable products than these two schools. Now, I do think these two schools could add a lot to the Big 12, but you have to figure out when you're going to do it. And frankly, I think if the Big 12 is offering right now, if that is totally true, and frankly, there are a lot of conflicting reports. Some say the Big 12 has no interest. Some say there is an offer coming on the table in the next week. So there's a number of different things going around. We'll obviously know more as it kind of unfolds, but what I will say is they can't wait. If there is an offer on the table, if ESPN is in on this, if everyone is pushing in the same direction, particularly ESPN, but let's just say there is enough people in that conference, presidents, ADs, all of those people that are pushing in the same direction to add these two right this second, they have to jump at that opportunity because there's a chance that it's not there in a year or it's not there in 2 years. And then you're sitting there. Yes, you're collecting money from these 10 programs that left you behind, but you're not getting anything on top of that. And you're not really expanding your brand, expanding who you are, and really setting yourself up for success in the future. So the way I look at it, I heard this news yesterday, and obviously Clemson and Florida State will play a huge role in this, although it sounds like that one is cooling down just a little bit because it sounds like the ACC is heading for disaster kind of regardless. I think Clemson and Florida State might just wait for that to happen for them to make a move. But overall, I think you look at the Big 12 and you look at Oregon State and Washington State. The way I look at it, it's a great deal for Oregon State and Washington State. It is an okay deal for the Big 12. And for that reason, I think Oregon State and Washington State have to jump at this as soon as they possibly can. If that offer is on the table, which is very much in question right about now, we will definitely find out more as the next couple of weeks go by. But the reality is, if that is on the table, if that is an option for your future, you take it and run with it, because there's a reality where it's not there in 6 months or it's not there in a year, and then you're left out pretty much just aimlessly floating in the college football world and the college sports world. So it's a great opportunity for Oregon State and Washington State to get a little bit of a lifeline. Will they take it, or do they even have it at this moment, will be something that we'll unpack over the next couple of days. But definitely a very interesting headline and one that could define a lot of realignment going forward. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about who needs a win the most in Week 1. We're going to talk about a number of teams, but I have one in particular that I think needs that Week 1 win more than any. So we'll talk about that right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all of the craziness going on with Oregon State and Washington State. It sounds like the Big 12 might just be an option for them. Obviously, we will learn more over the next couple of days, and we'll let you guys know immediately when we do, but definitely something in the air around those two schools. But let's get into the segment 2 here, and let's talk about who needs that Week 1 win the most. Who is the team that absolutely needs to get a win in Week 1, or the entire season could be in a little bit of jeopardy? And I think there's a number of options. Obviously, I want to say this from the jump. Week 1 is not the end-all be-all by any means. There is a number of things that happen after Week 1 that will define the season in a number of ways. So it's not that I'm saying if these teams lose in Week 1, you might as well write them off. They're going to be a terrible team this year. It's just to say a Week 1 loss could hurt these teams more than it would hurt someone else. So I want to start with Georgia. I do think Georgia needs that Week 1 win. I think you look at those games that are coming up at Ole Miss, at Texas, at Bama, and you got to make sure that you're in a position to possibly lose one or two of those games and still be in a position to go to the playoffs, to possibly go to the SEC championship. So I think this is a game where you go into a Clemson game, you live in Atlanta, or you're right next to Atlanta, you're going to have the fan base there, you're going to have a lot of things going in your direction. So this is one you got to win. I think you're going to give yourself a little bit of leeway when you win this one, or if you win this one. And if you don't, then you're in a position where you don't necessarily have to run the table, but I don't know if 9-3 gets you in. So that's definitely something that Georgia has to think about, and a huge week one matchup against Clemson for them. Penn State is another one that I think needs that week one win, because you're walking into Morgantown, and that is not a layup. Obviously, last year, it was a pretty fun game until the end. Penn State started to pull away, but going to Morgantown is a totally different ball game than playing at home. You were going to fight so many different things at Morgantown that you didn't have to a year ago, and they have to start with a win. If they don't start with a win in this game, then you have Ohio State ahead. You also have to go to LA to play USC. You have to go to Madison to play Wisconsin. There's too many questionable games going forward to think that Penn State's going to make a playoff game if they can't go into Morgantown and get a win. So that's one that definitely has to be a win for Penn State, I think, especially with some of the games coming up on the back end of that schedule. Starting off with a win is just so imperative for that team. USC and LSU, frankly, I want to say both of them need this win so bad, because I think both of them need a lot of confidence heading into the season. They have really, really fun offenses, defenses that don't necessarily give you too much by any means, so they're going to need a little confidence heading into the season. I lean a little bit more towards USC, I guess, but it's not like LSU has a ton of layups coming forward and they can just deal with this without any problem. So overall, I think both these teams need this win. I don't know, who needs it more hypothetically, but whoever walks out as a loser is fighting a really tough uphill battle. I can promise you that. And then finally, this one's a week 0 game, but Florida State needs that win against Georgia Tech. This is a team that you're walking in and you should be bigger, stronger in a number of different categories than this Georgia Tech team. And although you're playing in Ireland, there's a ton of different variables that go into that. There are way too many games on the schedule for you to drop this one. There's way too many games like SMU, like Clemson, like Miami, Florida, Notre Dame is on the schedule. There's too many games in the back half of the schedule for them to start off with a loss. This is an attackable Georgia Tech defense. They absolutely should be able to score, and be able to score pretty consistently in this game. And if they don't walk out with a win, then Florida State's entire season might go up in flames pretty quickly. But overall, the team that needs it more than anyone is the Florida Gators. I think you look at this team as they head into the season. Billy Napier has about as many questions around him as any head coach in the country. Maybe Sam Pittman has a couple more, but overall, Billy Napier is the story heading into the season for the Gators. There are a number of people who have already said, well, he's fired. This season doesn't necessarily matter. He's gone at the end of the year or in the middle of the year regardless. So it doesn't necessarily make a difference. I don't necessarily subscribe to that quite as much. I do think this is a good Florida team, but when you look at that first week game against Miami, you're going to have a huge one that you're going to, frankly, have to win. And let's start with the obvious here. The schedule is a nightmare. You look at all of the different things they're going to have to face this upcoming year. 2 weeks after this game, they have A&M coming to town. Then they go to Starkville. Then they have UCF at home. They have Tennessee, Kentucky, and then they have the nightmare 5-week schedule at the very end where it's Georgia, at Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, at Florida State. That's mean. I have said this a number of times. That is just outright abusive to Florida in the last 5 weeks of the season. So, point being, you have to find at least 5 wins before you get to that game. You have to make sure you're in a position to, maybe you can steal one of those back 5 games and make it to a bowl game, but you need to be in a position where you don't have to pick up 2 of those wins. You don't need to pick up 3 of those wins. Maybe you need to get 1 at some point throughout that 5-game stretch to make a bowl game. So that's the position that they're in. That's just the reality of this situation. So they need to find a way to get those big-time wins, and they will not be favored in that A&M game, if I had to imagine, especially if they beat Notre Dame. But if they fall to Notre Dame by 14 points, maybe that one's a little bit more even. They will be underdogs against Tennessee, and then UCF and Kentucky are not layups. So it's not like they're going into the first half of their schedule saying, that's a definite win, that's a definite win. I think Samford is the only one that's a definite win on the schedule, and that is not going to be enough for Florida by any means. So I think the biggest thing here, though, more than, the schedule and more than having to make a bowl game, is just the perception around that guy. We talk about Billy Napier so much throughout this offseason. He's someone that has a ton of attention on him going into this season, but there's a reality here where they lose in week 1 and all of the talk immediately changes from maybe there's something here to they're dead. This entire team has nothing to play for anymore. Billy Napier is not the head coach. He's going to be fired at some point this year. And would it be fair? Probably not, because it's a week 1 game, as we talked about, and not anything is really fully decided in week 1. But that's the reality of this situation. When you play an in-state rival like Miami, when you have so many questions heading into the year around your head coach, there's going to be people saying stuff at the end of that game, one way or the other. If Florida comes out on top, there will be people saying maybe Florida has something going down there with Billy Napier and we just need to give him some more time. If they lose that game, I can promise you there will be people in Florida garb calling for his job the next day. That's just the reality of this sport, and it's one where you look at Billy Napier this year, everything is perception for him. Perception is reality in a lot of different ways in the coaching world, and I think when you look at Billy Napier, the perception is not great right about now. If you look at the common college football fan, they don't necessarily love what this guy's doing at Florida. They don't necessarily think it's going to be a super successful model, and there's a lot of things going against him. I've talked about this before on here. That has not infiltrated the locker room yet, which is a huge, huge thing. You know, there's so many players talking about how incredible this has been for them and how great of an environment it's been in that building. That really matters. And frankly, it can go away in an afternoon. That's the reality of the sport, where you have so many guys to take care of. You have so many guys to worry about that if you lose a game to a team like Miami and the next morning they wake up and scroll Twitter and see all of these different comments about how their team is worthless and that this season is pointless and Billy Napier is going to get fired, you would lose those kids pretty quickly. And it's a terrible thing, obviously. It's the reality of the sport now with social media and with all of the different things that come into play. But he's done a really, really, really good job of keeping everyone engaged, of having everyone walk into the season with as much confidence as possible. That can go away in week 1. And if that does happen, then you're in a really, really tough spot going forward. And you're probably in a position where Billy Napier is gone before the end of the year. And that's the thing that really should worry this entire program, because the reality is anytime you go through a coaching hire or firing and hire, then you're going to have issues. You're going to have things to get over. And while I do think there's a lot of good things down at Florida, there's still some things to rebuild. There's no two ways about that. And I think there's a number of guys on this roster that if Billy Napier wasn't there, they wouldn't be there. And I think the number one guy, that is Billy Napier. The number one guy is DJ Lagway. I think you look at this quarterback, he is the most important guy on that roster right now. And I know he's not playing this year, which makes it sound a little bit crazy, but this is the guy that came in and they said, this is a program changer. This is a guy that can walk in, be your starter, lead you back to where Florida should be, and then walk off into the sunset, leaving the program much better than the way he found it. He is someone you need in that program. I tend to believe if Napier is fired and he walks out the door, DJ Lagway is not too far behind him, and he has a ton of calls coming in on that evening when Billy Napier is fired, whether it's allowed or not. I can promise you that. So he's one of those really, really talented guys, and along with him, you have LJ McCray, you have Eugene Wilson, you have a number of really talented guys on this roster that frankly would probably find somewhere else to play if Billy Napier was not on that staff, because as a lot of us know at this point, a lot of kids commit to a coach, they don't commit to a program. Whether I like that or not is totally up in the air. I don't necessarily love it, but that's the reality that we play in. So someone like DJ Lagway walking out of the program would put you back a number of years, because those guys don't just grow on trees. We know how important the quarterback position is from a recruiting perspective, and hitting it out of the park with a guy like this is not something that's going to happen every cycle, especially with a first-time head coach in a program that just fired a head coach in the middle of the season. So you're adding a ton of variables into a situation that is already very crazy and very variable in and of itself. So I do think this is a program that has a lot of good things. I think you look at the interior of this program and you would think that it would be, chaos with all of the questions around Billy Napier and all of the different things going into this year that could go sideways. You would think the behind the scenes would be a little bit sideways as well. It doesn't feel like it is. It feels like everyone is pulling in the same direction. Everyone understands that this is going to be a tough season, but we are good enough to pull this thing off. Billy Napier has all of the confidence in the world in his team, but when you look at that week 1 game, all of that could change in an afternoon. You're not playing, USF. You're not playing FAU. You're playing Miami. You're playing a team that a lot of your fan base hates, to their core they hate, and that really does matter when you walk into a season where you're trying to prove everyone wrong, where you're trying to do what everyone is saying you can't do. if you lose that game, you're proving everyone right in an afternoon. And frankly, you could prove them wrong throughout the rest of the season, but the chips will be stacked against you throughout the rest of the season because maybe you lose a couple of the players, at least in terms of being mentally all the way there. Maybe you lose some of the boosters that you absolutely need. And overall, you're going to lose a lot of the recruiting power that you had, and that is what kills a coach. So overall, I think when you look at those week 1 games, there are a number of ones that need to be wins for that particular team. I think Georgia absolutely needs a win against Clemson. I think Notre Dame likely needs a win against A&M. I think a number of different games to unpack there, but overall, I don't know if anyone touches what Florida needs in week 1. And frankly, they're not favored in that game, so it's not necessarily looking great for them to win that game, but Billy Napier might just need it, or his fate might just be sealed in that week 1 game, which would be a little bit ridiculous, but is the reality of the sport right now. So definitely will be a really interesting thing to watch, but when it comes to week 1 games, none is more important than that Florida-Miami game for Billy Napier. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the coaches poll. It came out a couple of days ago. I want to break that down, give you guys an idea of who I think is a little too high, who I think is a little too low, and we'll break down a couple of different outcomes of this. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different things going on around week 1 and who really needs a win. When I look at it, I think no one needs a win more than Billy Napier and the Florida Gators, but definitely a number of teams that need that first week win to go on to a big time season this upcoming year. But let's get into the coaches poll. There is a number of things coming out this time of year, a number of different things to talk about, and the coaches poll just came out, and I want to break it down for you guys. It's one of those things that comes out, and a lot of people have some different opinions on it, as do I, but overall, it's always really interesting to see what the coaches think about this upcoming year, and definitely really interesting who they think is up top, and it's the team that I have up top. It is Georgia. They have a number of the first place votes, 46 out of the, 55 first place votes there. So a huge thing for this program. They are right where they should be. There's no doubt about it. They have the best coach in the country. They have one of the best rosters in the country. They are everything that you want Georgia to be. There are some worries on that defensive side of the ball, but right now they are my top team in the country as well, partly because of the difference in quarterback at Georgia and Ohio State. And Ohio State is 2. They got 7 first place votes in this thing. Definitely a very, very talented, incredible team this upcoming year. It sounds like Will Howard is coming along a little bit more in practice and taking a little bit more ownership of that position. That is absolutely huge for this program and definitely something they need this year. Then you have Oregon and Texas right where they usually are at 3 and 4. Texas did get a first place vote. I have a suspicion that it is Lane Kiffin. I don't know why, but I do think that's who it was. Michigan does have a first place vote all the way down at 10. I think that's just the coach that says, whoever won the last national championship is number 1 until week 1 expires. So I do kind of understand that way of thinking. Definitely a very interesting thing to see, but absolutely is one of those things that some old-fashioned coaches absolutely do believe. Bama, starting at 5, is the lowest start they've ever had in the coaches poll since 2009. That's insane, and gives you an idea of just how ridiculous they were throughout that time during Saban's run. Ole Miss right there, Notre Dame, Michigan, Penn State, and Florida State round out the top 10, and there are a number of really good teams here, but I do have a number of questions. I think you look at a team like, well, actually, I'll get into it here in a second, but let's break down who I think is too high, who I think is too low, and then pretty much everyone else is right around where they should be. Let's start with too high, and I think Michigan at number 8 is just a little bit too high to me. When I look at this team, I have a number of questions, particularly on the offensive side of the ball. But you look at a guy like Alex Orji, who has all of the talent in the world, who has athletic ability that is unlike pretty much any other quarterback in the entire country. Him not being consistent enough is going to be a problem for this offense. If he is the guy and he's the one that trots out there with the first team, he's going to have to be more consistent than he has shown thus far. So I think putting him above, a Penn State, a Florida State, a Missouri, I think I don't necessarily love that too much. I think there's a number of other teams that just feel a little bit more solid to me. I think Penn State's kind of up in the air, definitely some debate there. I think Florida State feels like the more solid team, at least from where I'm standing. Obviously, there's some debate there as well, but when I look at Michigan, there's just too many questions out there for me to sit there and say they are absolutely a top 10 team heading into this year. LSU is also at 12. I don't necessarily love that. I think when you look at it, kind of like Michigan, a little bit more so than Michigan, but there are huge amounts of questions on one side of the ball for me to put them at this position. That defensive side has a number of really good players, and I do think they're going to be a relatively good unit this upcoming year, but we don't know that. It's still very much up in the air, and one of those things that I just need to see more before I'm really confident putting LSU up there. Obviously, I am buying into LSU. I do have them as a playoff team this upcoming year, but I do think going into the year, there are just too many questions for me to sit there and say they are better than a Utah or a Clemson or really even a Tennessee, if I'm being totally honest. So there's a number of different things. I'm betting on them, of course, but still a number of questions that I don't necessarily love around the Tigers right about now. Oklahoma at number 16 is one that I kind of fought back and forth on. I do really like this Oklahoma team. I think they're going to develop into a really fun team, honestly, this upcoming year. But when you look at the two line of scrimmages and you have a number of questions about the depth there, about the confidence of really even the front line in a lot of ways, you have to be worried, especially playing in a conference like the SEC. You're not going to be able to walk into that thing with not elite offensive line play. If you don't walk into that thing without elite offensive line play or defensive line play, you're going to get run all over. That's just the reality, and it's one of those things that when Oklahoma walks into this conference, I just think there's that big hurdle that they're going to have to get over, and while I think a number of other things are in place from the quarterback, running back, wide receiver group, when you have those two line of scrimmage problems, none of that other stuff really matters all that much, because if you can't control the line of scrimmage, you're going to lose way too many games. Florida State is another. I think they could be in this kind of realm of being a little bit too high. I have some questions about that offense, but overall, I don't think it's all that crazy where they're at number 10. On the way to too low. Now we'll get into number 13, Utah. I think when I look at this team, there's no questions. I have a number of questions that are kind of hypothetical. Like, can Cam Rising be who he used to be? Well, if he's healthy, there's no reason to think he can't be. Or can a team that always has a solid running game find a running game? Well, they always do. So I'm not necessarily too worried about that. Andy Ludwig is one of the better coordinators when it comes to setting up a run game for his team. So overall, you look at the questions going into this year for Utah, and they're kind of hypothetical. If Cam Rising does go down, they do have a problem. But if he's healthy, I have no reason to believe anything but he's going to play really good football. The run game could not come along, but they have a number of guys there that I feel confident in, and Andy Ludwig always finds a run game. So I'm not going to sit here and say that Utah has all of these issues, because all the issues are kind of hypothetical at this very moment. They are going to play really good football. I do have them as a top 10 team heading into this year. I think when you have Kyle Whittingham, when you have Morgan Scalley, when you have Andy Ludwig at the coordinator position and the head coaching position, you're going to have really solid football. It might not be, the most flashy thing in the world. It might not be perfect every single week, but they're going to play good defense. They're not going to get penalized a lot, and they're going to make the life really tough on their opponent. So overall, I do have this team a little bit higher than some people do. I'm not necessarily buying into them to run the table in the Big 12 this upcoming year, but at least going into the year, they are the team that I'm circling as the best team in the Big 12 as we head into it. And then number 20, Texas A&M. I think this is a team that has every chance to make a ton of noise this upcoming year. Obviously, playing the schedule that they're going to play, there's going to be a number of chances. Whether you want to, go out and beat LSU or beat Texas at the end of the year, there's a number of different places where A&M can make some noise, really, make a run at possibly even an SEC title or the playoff at the end of the day. And I think you look at some of the teams above them. You have a Miami team that I think is going to be a ton of fun, and I do think is going to be a really good team. I have them going to the playoff as the ACC title champion. But when you look at this team going into the year, there's a ton of transfers. And when you look at a team that is adding that many transfers to particularly a defense that was not necessarily where it needed to be a year ago, you're going to have questions until they step on the field. I do think it's going to be a really awesome team, but when I look at A&M, they just have more stability around the positions that they're going to need to than Miami does at this very moment. Now, I do think Miami's going to likely be a better team because I think a lot of those transfers are going to come through, but as I head into the season, I would lean A&M just a little bit over Miami, but also I might just have both of them a little bit higher on this list overall. And then number 23, USC. I think this is a team that has just so much potential, and it comes down to one guy, obviously. When you bring in someone like DeAnton Lynn from UCLA, who had a top 20 unit a year ago, was incredible against the run, and has been just remarkable. He's coming into a defense that frankly just has more talent than the UCLA defense did a year ago. Now, they are far away from where they need to be, obviously, but I do think they're in a position where the offense is going to be explosive. They're going to be able to score points. Miller Moss is playing really good football in fall camp right now, and if you can just play passable defense, you're going to be able to make some plays. So when I look at this team, although I do have questions on one side of the ball, although the defense has not come along the way that I want it to, it doesn't mean they have to come along a very short way to get there. I don't think they have to come, they don't have to get to the top 20 team in the country or top 30 defense in the country by any means. I think they have the ability to get to top 80 and still make a run in this conference and still make some noise. Maybe not win the conference because that's obviously going to be a huge part of it. But overall, I think they do have the ability to make more noise than maybe some people are thinking right about now. So I think you look at that Penn State game. That would be a huge opportunity for USC to make some noise here and definitely be a big-time problem for some other teams. So overall, I think the coaches poll is always kind of a fun thing to break down. To me, it's one of those things that you look at the coaches right about now, they're not focused on about anything else other than their team. So it's one of those things that you tend to get exactly what the media has given you in some different ways. You'll get some ers and ahs here. You'll definitely get some things that we'll unpack over the rest of the season. But overall, a lot of these coaches are focused on what they're doing. They'll put in, a little 25-team list there, but overall, it's not really their job to worry about it. I don't necessarily think you take too much away from this, but overall, I do think it's really cool to see what the coaches think going into the season, who they think is the top team. They do think it is Georgia, and who they think are some dangerous teams. I think Tennessee fits into that category. I think USC as well. So there's a number of teams that are going to be really fun to watch, but always cool to break down what the coaches think and see, how they're viewing the season as we head into it. But let's take our third break here, and when we come back, we just have to figure out who needs to have a big-time fall camp. There are a number of teams that we've broken down over the last couple of days. We have 6 more teams for you today, so we'll break them down right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the coaches poll, gave you a little reaction from that, gave you an idea of who I think is a little too high, who I think is a little too low, and who I think is just right. But overall, definitely a very interesting exercise, always something that I like to break down this time of year. But let's get into the players that just have to make the most of fall camp. We've broken down, I believe, 9 teams up until this point. We have 6 more for you today. So let's get into this and let's start to break down these players, because at Penn State, you have a guy that just has to hit. Drew Aller is in a position where you had a year last year where you played some good football. If you look at his numbers from last year, it's going to paint a very different picture than what you saw against Ohio State and Michigan, because he tore apart pretty much everyone else. He needs to take that next step forward and be the guy that is going to walk into Buckeye Stadium and not be fazed, is going to be able to play his top-level game. And we talked about how huge that West Virginia game is. He needs to come out of the gates firing. He needs to show that he's taken that little step forward into being a more dangerous player this upcoming year. I think he has all of the capability to do that, but this fall camp is huge for him. not only from a physical standpoint into getting to where he needs to be on the field, but from a leadership perspective. He's got to take a step forward there. He's got to be a little bit more forward-facing. So a number of different things that go into the next couple of weeks for him, but overall, he just got to execute over the next couple of weeks, and then we'll see where the chips fall once the season starts. And I do think he's a fantastic player that's going to be really fun to watch this year. And then Harrison Wallace is the guy that I'm watching because when I look at this wide receiver room, I don't see a wide receiver one. I think Julian Fleming is a really good player. I don't think he's a guy that you can rely on every single down to be your go-to guy. I don't think he's a Marvin Harrison Jr. and Isaiah Bond, that type of player. So overall, I think I don't know why I put Isaiah Bond with Marvin Harrison Jr. They're very different. But overall, I don't think he's a wide receiver one. I think Harrison Wallace could be that guy. I think he has that. He's long, athletic, really talented player, and he gives Drew Aller a guy that can give him the ball downfield or even short field and just let him make plays with his legs. So he's a very, very talented player. You need multiple options going down the field, and they can't be multiple tight ends. You have to have multiple wide receivers that can make big-time plays if you're going to want to compete in this conference. And frankly, as I see it, I think Harrison Wallace is really one of the few guys on that team that can make that big-time leap. Let's move on over to Missouri, and let's talk about an SMU transfer there. Marcus Bryant is coming in as likely their left tackle, and frankly, he wouldn't be coming in as their left tackle if Caden Green had worked out the way that they wanted to. The transfer over from Oklahoma came in as technically a left tackle. He was a left guard at Oklahoma. They felt like they could move him out to left tackle. It did not work. They brought in Marcus Bryant during the spring portal cycle, and he's going to have to be huge because you have a guy in Brady Cook who is a very good player, is going to make a number of really good plays, but struggled with accuracy a number of times last year, and he's going to need time. That is the number one thing for this team to be successful. You have all the weapons on the outside with the ridiculous trio of wide receivers that they have. You just got to give your quarterback time to digest everything. If he can do that, he's going to be a really, really dangerous player. But that left tackle position is the most important for that to happen. So obviously will be a huge thing to unpack throughout the season and could define Missouri's season in a number of different ways. Toriano Pride Jr. is the other guy that I'm watching very, very closely. I think when you look at this back end, there are good players back there. But you lost Enos Rakestraw. You lost Chris Abrams-Drain. That's the name I was looking for. You do have Drayden Norwood back there. I do think that's a really, really good player, but you can't be in shootouts. And to not be in shootouts, you're going to have to be able to cover a number of really good receivers throughout this entire conference. And it's not just one guy. You know, it's not just Nick Anderson coming to town for OU. It's Deion Burks, and it's a number of different receivers for Oklahoma. And then you have a number of other teams on that schedule that are going to give you trouble on that outside. So you can't be in a bunch of shootouts. You have to have a back end that is going to be able to hold their own, and Toriano Pride Jr. is about as important of a role as anyone can play in that in this upcoming season for them. And then you look at a team like Miami. They brought in someone from Michigan State this past cycle, Simeon Barrow Jr., and they thought they were bringing in him and Derek Harmon. Derek Harmon is now up at Oregon. That was a very weird portal recruitment, so definitely one that they did not want to lose, but they have. And they're going to need someone that is just going to deliver pretty much every single week. That's going to have to be Simeon Barrow Jr. as far as I'm concerned. I think you look at the depth and it's solid. It's not great at that position. You're going to need someone that can really hold things down and feel confident that when you send him out there, you're going to get good play from that position. So overall, I think he's a really good player. He absolutely is making strides early on in fall camp that he needs to, but he needs to be a big-time player throughout this season, or they're going to be in a position where they just don't get the push they need to make a real run this upcoming year. And then Michelle Powell is the other guy that I'm watching. This back end lost so many big-time players. When you talk about James Williams and Cameron Kitchens, those were the guys kind of keeping this whole thing together. Now, it wasn't necessarily pretty all that much last year, so there are a number of things that need to get fixed, but they still need a leader in that back end. I do think this is going to be that guy. He has been very outspoken throughout fall camp thus far, and I think when you talk about this team, they probably go as their back end goes. When they played poorly last year on the back end, the entire team suffered really badly because when you can have a game totally change on one play, you're going to have some problems. It was the same problem that Texas had a year ago. It was the same problem that a number of teams have had throughout the last couple of years. So that's something they're going to have to fix, and Michelle Powell is likely the guy that's going to have to fix it, frankly. And then let's go over to Utah and let's talk about Jalen Glover. I talk about this team a ton, and it's one of those teams that as long as Cam Rising is healthy, you feel confident about that passing game. It's not necessarily going to be, crazy explosive or do anything wild, but they're going to do enough. There's no two ways about that. The run game, as we talked about earlier, is a little bit of an issue. You are worried about that heading into the season. Jaquindon Jackson was a huge loss at that running back position. He is now over at Arkansas, and Jalen Glover has to step in. He has had over 500 yards a year ago. You also have Micah Bernard in that room, so it's not like it has to be all Jalen Glover, but this is the guy that I think is the more special athlete. Let's just put it that way. I do think he has that higher ceiling and definitely can be a player that really opens up this run game, and with that opens up the entire offense. And then Cameron Calhoun is someone I'm watching very, very closely. A little bit blurry of a picture there, apologies, but a very good player that I think could make this back end just a no-fly zone outright. I think Teo Johnson is a fantastic player in that back end. I think they have a number of guys that are going to play really good football. You need some depth there. You need some guys that are going to play big-time roles coming off the bench, and Cameron Calhoun coming over from Michigan as a redshirt freshman is likely going to be that guy. When you face teams like Oklahoma State, when you face Arizona coming to your house, you're going to have a number of cornerbacks that can go out there and you can trust them with all your heart. And it sounds like Cameron Calhoun is going to be that next guy up, so he's going to have a huge camp and make them feel very confident putting him into the game in the fall. And then let's go over to another Big 12 team. Let's talk about Kansas State, and that is Dante Cephas, who came over from Penn State. And the Kansas State run game is going to be incredible. It's going to be so much fun to watch. They have three different guys that I think could be top running backs or a top quarterback on any team pretty much across the country. Avery Johnson, DJ Giddens, Dylan Edwards are going to be so much fun to watch. They need more guys in the pass game. I think J.C. Brown is a fantastic player. I think Keegan Johnson is a really fun player that plays really good football. I think Dante Cephas is the one that could really take him over the top. He had 1,000 yards back in 2021, had over 700 in 2022 before transferring to Penn State and just having an overall tough year. Some of that was scheme-based, some of that was him just not playing his best football, but overall, there's going to be opportunities for him to make some big-time plays, and he's going to have to for Kansas State to be the scary team on offense that they're definitely capable of being. And then they got a transfer from Ball State on that back end. Jordan Riley is a super important player for this team. I love the cornerbacks that they have. When you talk about Keenan Garbers and you talk about Jacob Parrish, both are just incredible players. I do think they're going to be awesome on that back end, but when you talk about a back end defense, that strong safety or free safety is hugely important. That guy that's going to sit in the middle of the field or at least sit in a deep zone and be huge in terms of just keeping a hat on a lot of these offenses. And they face a lot of good ones, particularly Arizona is the one that I'm circling because they're going to have to keep up with some really good receivers in a pass game that has a really good quarterback running it. So a guy like Jordan Riley had 61 tackles at Ball State a year ago, is slated to start on that back end, and frankly, I think he's going to have to be a huge player for them to be the dominant force they can be on that back end with the two corners that they have that I think are just remarkable. But you need more there than just two guys. And then Notre Dame. Emil Wagner is the guy that I want to talk about because, as we talked about, I believe yesterday, maybe the day before, Charles Jagusa is out for the year with a torn ACL. That is a huge hit for this team because when you look at the depth chart at the offensive tackle position, beyond Emil Wagner and Tosh Baker at this point, you have a redshirt freshman, and then you have three freshmen. So you're not in a position where you can really lose much of anyone else. And it sounds like Emil Wagner is playing really good football throughout the start of fall camp. Tosh Baker is the more experienced player, so there is a reality where he moves on over to left tackle and Emil Wagner stays at right tackle. Regardless, Emil Wagner is going to be a huge player for this team. I tend to believe he's going to be the guy at left tackle because I think if Tosh Baker was going to be the guy, he would have been even when Charles Jagusa was healthy. So that's beside the point, but I do think Emil Wagner is going to be a huge player, and you don't want to be picking between two lesser of two evils to play that left tackle position. You want to feel confident about both those guys going out there, and you need him to stay healthy. So Emil Wagner is going to be huge for this team. And then the other guy I'm watching is Jaden Greathouse. I think you look at this passing offense, and so far throughout fall camp, it feels like they've taken a big-time step forward. Chris Mitchell is playing really good football. We talked about Jaden Thomas a number of times. Mitchell Evans is going to be huge through the pass game. They have a number of things up there that they just haven't had in the past at that wide receiver room and really the passing game as a whole. I think Jaden Greathouse is the guy that jumps off the page. I think he's the guy that, especially going into his true sophomore season, has so much potential to make some noise. Had a year that was a little bit up and down, but frankly, he was the guy that they were relying on to make a lot of those plays, and that's not necessarily fair for a freshman wide receiver. So I do think he has a chance to really open things up this year, especially with guys like Chris Mitchell and Jaden Thomas kind of taking a little bit of that pressure off, and Bo Collins coming over from Clemson. But I do think when you talk about this team, especially going forward, Jaden Greathouse opens the door in recruiting, and that's what they need on this roster. They don't need, just a flash-in-the-pan, really good wide receiver group with some transfers coming in. They need a guy that can spark, freshmen coming in as really talented wide receivers. They got a really good guy here in Jaden Greathouse a couple of years ago. It's kind of gone a little bit stale over the last couple of cycles, and they need to get it kick running again. So I do think a true sophomore showing out this upcoming year could be huge for them, and I think Jaden Greathouse is one of those guys that could make a number of big-time plays this upcoming year. So overall, there's a ton of guys that have to make a ton out of fall camp. When you look at fall camp this time of year, there are so many different variables heading into this thing that you need to be very confident in as you head into this season. So that's really what it comes down to, filling a gap that has been formed, whether it's injury or guy leaving from the past year, whatever that looks like. You're going to need some guys to step up and play big-time roles, and I think there are a number of guys that can do it, but these next couple of weeks are going to be hugely important for them to do it this upcoming year. But let's take our final break here, and when we come back, we're going to do some conference questions. We're going to move on to the Big Ten today. Did the SEC yesterday, so we'll unpack a couple of questions around the Big Ten and how I feel about just a crazy year over there in the Big Ten this upcoming year. So stick with us, and we'll be right back with that. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the players that just have to make the most of the next couple of weeks. Emil Wagner, a offensive tackle up in Notre Dame, might be the number one on that list with the injury that just happened to them over at that tackle position. But let's get into some conference questions. Let's talk about the Big Ten today. We got into the SEC yesterday, but I have a ton of questions about the Big Ten that I want to unravel for you guys. So let's jump into this. And the biggest question I have, at least around Nebraska, is can Matt Rule continue that big 2-year bump that he's kind of been known for throughout his college career? Obviously, this is a big-time question that pretty much everyone has for this Nebraska team. There are a number of things going into this year that are heading in a really good direction for this Nebraska team. They're returning a defense that is really, really good. I believe number 11 in the country a year ago, returned 9 of the starters from that team and added a couple of really big-time players, including Bly Hill on that back end. So I do think they're in a position to play really, really good defense. Are introducing a freshman quarterback, which we'll get to here in a second. But when you talk about Matt Rule and this Nebraska team, they, from year one, or when you talk about Matt Rule in general, let's just start there. Temple, year 1 to year 2, 4 more wins than he had in year 1. Baylor, 6 more wins than he had in year 1 compared to year 2. If he continues that pace, this is a 10-win Nebraska team that you're looking at because they had 5 wins a year ago. So this is a very, very talented team, a team that could be a playoff team. The biggest difference between that Temple team and that Baylor team and this team is the first year is when he had that freshman quarterback. The first year is when he had a guy like, why am I blanking on his name? Charlie Brewer at Baylor. He had him his freshman year. He came back for his sophomore year, and they blew up. At Temple, it was P.J. Walker, the now NFL player, that first year was a little bit shaky. Second year came back and was much more confident in that offense. That's not the case this year. It's Dylan Raiola walking into an entirely new roster, an entirely new offense, and having to execute pretty much from the get-go because they play some big-time games right to start, including Colorado in Week 2. So this is a ton of pressure on that guy's shoulders and on Matt Rule's shoulders. You have to figure out a way to make sure that this freshman wide receiver with this freshman quarterback, with some wide receivers that are new to the group, or he just doesn't have that, really confident connection with. You have to make sure that you can be able to win games with that. So that comes down to game planning on the offensive side of the ball. Frankly, overall, they're just walking a much tighter tightrope this time around than he was at Baylor or Temple. Partly because of this, partly because of the teams that they're going to have on the other sideline. Because you're going to be playing Ohio State. You're going to be playing some of these really, really tough teams, and you can drop those games. It's not like you have to win those games, but you got to show that you can compete. I think 8 wins would be a big-time win for this team overall. There are some people that want them to go to the playoff. I know there are some Nebraska fans that think that is the moniker for this team. I'd be shocked if that was the moniker for this team. But I do think 8 wins is a big-time boost and keeps you moving in the right direction. And then maybe in Dylan Raiola's second year in the offense and second year in the program, they can make a big-time jump into being a possible playoff team. But overall, I do think that leap's going to happen. How big it is will obviously be a big-time question. And it'll come down to how good is Dylan Raiola really. But let's move on to Penn State, and the biggest question I have is, can they win those big-time games this year? You look at this Penn State team, and they've been really good for quite some time. Ever since James Franklin showed up, they've been a really good team, one of the top 12 teams in the country, so a playoff team in a number of different years. The problem is, when they play Ohio State and Michigan, they look just inferior in a number of different ways over the last couple of years. They've just looked like the worst team across the board, and that is something they just have to fix. As they move into this playoff era, it favors Penn State about as much as it favors pretty much anyone in the entire country, because they would have gotten in 14 and 15 and 16 and a number of different years throughout the past little bit if it was a 12-team playoff instead of a 4-team playoff. But this is what's gotten in their way, losing to Ohio State, losing to Michigan, and they don't have to play Michigan or Oregon this year, so that makes them feel a little bit better. But the reality is, I've talked about this a little bit on here before, you go 11-1, let's say. You lose to Ohio State the way that they tend to do, and then you go to the playoff. If you lose that playoff game, do you feel any better as a Penn State fan? Obviously, you got to the playoff, and that's a cool moniker for you to kind of grow from going forward, but the reality is you still didn't win those big games. You still didn't win the games that you have to win going forward. So overall, I think when you look at this team, it's a very good team. It has a number of things going for it. And frankly, I think it's going to be a playoff team. But they have an opening here. And frankly, they need to kick down the doors because they have everything going in their direction, from schedule to the playoff to a number of different things. And winning those big time games and getting James Franklin over that hump that he's been dealing with is going to be huge for that team going forward. Well, now let's talk about USC and Iowa and just talk about how important those coordinators are. Can they be contenders with those new coordinators? Because you look at those two programs, only one side of the ball has been getting in the way. When it's at Iowa, it was the offense, and they brought in Tim Lester. He had been at the Packers. He's been at a number of different colleges throughout his career, and I have a number of different questions. I do think this is going to be a better offense than it has been before, but the bar is on the floor. I think we all understand that, and he's going to add some motion into this offense that should have been added about 10 years ago, but regardless, some things are going to happen in this offense that have not happened in the past. The question is, how much is it going to be different? Because a lot has to change, but Brian Ferentz is still the head coach, and he just fired his son that was the OC there, and I wonder how much the offense is really going to change regardless of who's calling plays. Because sometimes you go into a place and you call their offense. You don't call yours. You call the one that has been in place. And that could be the case here. But if it's not the case, if he's able to run the offense the way that he sees fit, and they elevate that offense kind of the same way I was just talking about USC to a top 80 unit, a top 70 unit in the country, they're going to win some games that you do not expect them to win. And then you do have DeAnton Lynn taking over as DC at USC, and frankly, that problem should have been fixed a number of years ago because Alex Grinch wasn't the guy, plain and simple. But DeAnton Lynn is there. He did an incredible job at UCLA a year ago and is a fantastic defensive coordinator. He is someone that could really open things up. I think the same way with Iowa, where you have some things that are deeper than just who's calling plays that need to be fixed. If those things are starting to get fixed over there, which it kind of seems like they are as of right now, then they're going to be in good shape going into this year. if they're not necessarily fixed from a strength and conditioning standpoint and from all of the different, physicality things that they have to fix, they're not going to be a really good team. They're not going to be a really good defense, and D'Anton Lynn's hire is not going to look as good as it possibly could have down the road. So overall, I think you look at both of these units, the USC offense, the Iowa defense, they're going to be elite. There's no question about those. No matter what, they're going to play good football. The other two sides just have to play passable football, and whichever one of these coordinators has a better or does a better job this upcoming year, that team is likely going to have more success than the other. That's just the reality, and I think that USC defense is probably a little bit closer to getting that than Iowa offense, but I could be totally proven wrong, honestly. And then I want to get into the dark horse of this conference because, frankly, I don't know if there really is one. I understand that there are a number of teams like Nebraska, Iowa, USC that could make some noise from that second tier, from that third tier, possibly an Indiana team even making crazy noise this upcoming year. But Oregon and Ohio State are the most complete, deep rosters in this conference by a pretty comfortable margin. And then you take a little bit of a step down, you have Penn State and Michigan State. Or Michigan, not Michigan State. You have Penn State and Michigan that are right there as well. Frankly, beyond that, I'm not confident that anyone can really compete for this conference. I do think there are teams that can make noise. I do think Nebraska can make some noise. I do think Iowa, USC can absolutely be 9-3 teams, be right in that conversation. But when it comes down to it, when they have to play Ohio State, when they have to play Michigan, when they have to play Oregon, it's not going to matter too much. So overall, I think there are teams that could be dark horses in this conference, but I do see kind of this big-time gap between the top four and everyone else, and I don't necessarily think USC is going to be a team that's going to be able to walk into Ann Arbor and get a big-time win over Michigan, or maybe they can get a win over Penn State when they come to them, but overall, I don't necessarily love the second tier of this conference to really make some big time noise. I think they could win all of the games below them, but once it comes time to win those big time games, kind of like a Penn State situation, it's just going to be too much for them. So overall, I think there are dark horses potential in this conference. I'm not sure there is a outright dark horse as I see it right this second. And then I want to talk about what's the most defining game of the Big Ten this upcoming year. There are a number of big-time games. There's no two ways about that. I think a lot of people would point to Ohio State-Michigan because of the big-time rivalry, because of what's happened the last couple of years, and because Ohio State has so much going into this year. A lot of people will point to Ohio State-Oregon because you look at those two teams, those are the two best teams in the conference going into this year and will be absolutely huge for this conference. But for me, it's one game in particular, and it's Michigan versus Oregon. I think I look at this game in particular in Ann Arbor, and it's where Oregon kind of earns their stripes. It's where they prove that they belong in this conference. It's where they maybe knock off the team that just, controlled the conference for the last 3 years and plant their flag towards the top of that conference. It's November 2nd, going to be an incredible game. If Oregon loses to Michigan, Michigan's right back in a place where they can stay at the top of this conference. All they would have to do is compete with Ohio State the same way they've been doing the last couple of years, and they would be in a position to go to the Big Ten championship, to win it, and possibly go to the playoffs. So this is one of those turning door moments. And then you look at a team like Penn State, who's not remotely involved in this game, but if Michigan does end up winning, then Penn State has a little bit tougher of a road to the championship game because Ohio State, they would have to possibly beat them to get there, with Ohio State beating Michigan at the end of the year hypothetically. So overall, I think when you look at this Michigan team, they're in a position to kind of screw a lot of things up this upcoming year because you look at this game in particular, I think a lot of us are picking Oregon in that game. As of right now, I don't feel fully confident that Oregon is fully there physically to compete with a team like Michigan, at least on the line of scrimmage. I do think they have a ton of ability all across the field that is going to be the difference in this game overall, but I think Michigan could dictate the rest of the season in one afternoon. They could decide, how big of a deal is some of these big-time games down the stretch, the Penn State-Ohio State, the Michigan-Ohio State, how big of a games are those, the Oregon-Ohio State game, how huge are those games, and then also who can actually make it to the title game. I think if Oregon wins this one, I think they're in a great position to make it. I think Penn State is in a little bit tougher of position. I think if Michigan wins this one, I think Penn State's in a little bit better of position to possibly make it with an 11-1 record. So overall, I think this is the game that I look at and say, that's where a lot of this is going to be decided. That's where, two of the top 4 teams in the conference meet, but also the former champion against the new buck in the conference, and we'll see what happens there. But overall, it's going to be awesome to watch that, and I just cannot wait for this Big Ten season overall. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC podcast. GSMC College Football Podcast. I keep messing that up. But that'll do it for the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have really incredible people covering everything you could want. So whether it's Olympics or NFL or baseball that you're after, we have you totally covered on the GSMC Sports page. So come on over and check us out, and you will not regret it. I can promise you that. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.